Table testing in Golang is a convenient and extensible way of writing tests. In this video, we're going to take a look at how to define an API, define some validations on that API, write some basic tests, and move on to table tests. So in VS Code, I have an empty project right now, and I'm going to create a new file called main.go and call this package main and define the main function here. I'm also going to create a test file, main_test.go, and for now just set the package and leave it as it is. Now in the main file, I'm going to now create the API or the user API message. This is just going to be a simple struct called user, and user is a user, so I'm going to write a short comment here, and let's define some fields on this user. The user has an ID, which is a string, a name field that is a string, and age, which is an integer. And now we can add some validations for this user. So I'm going to create a validate function that takes the user as a receiver and returns an error if there's a validation error. So at the moment, I'm just going to return nil and write a short comment on this function. So validates the user. Now let's define some criteria for these fields. For the ID, let's say we support only lowercase letters and numbers, and let's say a character limit between 3 and 16 characters. And for the name, let me just adjust the size here a little bit so you can see this better. So for the name field, let's say no restrictions except a 50 character limit. And for the age, let's keep it between 18 and 120. Now you can define any of these values the way you want to, but let's use these for examples. Now let's start defining these validations. So for the user ID, I would prefer to use a regex for this. So we are going to define a user ID regex variable and use the built-in regex package and use the must_compile function. And must_compile, make sure that this regex actually compiles before it's used, and the import is auto-imported by VS Code. Now I'm going to define this regex. So I use these two characters to define the beginning and the end of the regex. And if I use the square brackets, I can define the allowed character set. So it could be A to Z and 0 to 9. These characters are allowed in this regex. And then if I use these brackets, I can define the size. So the minimum size would be, say, 3, and the max would be not 36, 16. So let's set that. And we have to make sure that the user ID matches this regex. To do that, what we can do here is take the regex, user ID regex rather, dot match string. There are many options. I'm just going to take match string for now and pass the ID of the user here. And we are seeing if the regex matches the string. And if it doesn't match, then we need to return an error. In order to be precise, let's define some named errors or error definitions. And the first one, let's say error invalid user ID. And we can use the fmt.errorf function to define the error message. So we can call it invalid user ID. And in this case, we just return this particular error if the user ID doesn't match this regex. So that looks pretty good. Now let's move on to the next value, which is the name. For the name, we only have a 50 character limit, so we only have to check the length. So instead of hard coding this, I'm going to make it a constant. And let's say max user name length, and set it to 50. And if the length of this name field of the user struct, the len, is greater than the value we've defined as a constant 50, then we return a different error. So let's once again define an error here. Error name too long, maybe that's a good name, and just print that out. User name longer than 50 characters. And we can return this error. And for the age, we need to check that it is within a range of 2 values. So let's define the minimum as min user age as 18 and max user age as 120. And now we can just do some comparison. If the age is greater than the maximum, or if it is lesser than the minimum, then what we can do, let's remove less than equal to, actually, just lesser than. Then we can say this is an error, so this is out of range. We can define a new error here, error user or age out of range. And in the error message, we can say something like user age should be between or must be between 18 and 120. And we can return that error. So we've added some basic validation for our 3 fields in the user struct. And we have 3 fields here, of course, and we just defined some validations. And for each of the validations, I've defined some values here. And then we can look at the validation function, which basically uses these values to check if those particular fields are within that limit. Otherwise, we return specific errors for each cases. The first case is the user ID regex. The second case is the length of the name. And the final value here would be the age of the user. And that's within 2 preset constant limits. So now in the test file, let's define a testing function. So we can call it test user, and this is the format. So it takes the testing.t struct as an argument. And the first thing we have to do is define a user for which we want to test. So let's define the user, and let's say the ID is Alice. The name is going to be, for example, Alice Smith. And the age is, let's say, 25. Note that all of these are valid values. So first we're testing the valid case. So what we do now is to call the validate function of this user. And as we've defined, it takes some limits and does some checks. And in this case, since it's a valid value, we don't expect any error. So if there is an error, so error not equal to nil, then we print an unexpected error and the name of the actual error. And I'll just add a comment here that this is a valid case. Now we don't expect an error to occur here. So in a separate terminal window, what I'm going to do is to take the location of my package after go source and say go test, or sorry, go test -v, which is verbose, and then just going to paste that. So I see that there's an error that this is not in std. This is a really common fix because there's no mod file. So let's just initialize that using go mod init, and this just generates the go.mod, defines the module and also the go version. And at the moment we only have these standard packages, so we don't have to technically run go mod tidy, but I'm just going to do it for the sake of completeness. And as you can see, there's no go.sum file created here because these are just standard packages. So now if we run that test again, you see that the test has passed and that works. So this is a valid case and this is what we expect. Now let's create one invalid case. Let's say the invalid ID. And for that, I'm just going to take the same user defined above and overwrite the ID with some junk value. Note that we only support lowercase characters. for this ID value, so these characters that we've defined won't work. And now what we can do is just copy the error handling, or just create error handling. Before that, let's call the validate function once again. And in this case, since it's invalid, we are expecting an error. So in order to match the error, we are going to use this errors.is function. This is part of the standard errors package. And so if you remember, when we defined these errors, we defined a specific error for each invalid case. And so what we are going to do is use this function to compare the error that we get from the validate function to the target that we are checking. So, and it returns a Boolean value, and if the Boolean is false, that means the error is not matched. So in the first case, because it's an invalid ID, we have defined a special error here called error invalid ID. So the output error should be the same one. And if that does not match, that means we're having the wrong value. So I'm just going to embed the validation inside it. And now we can return this same thing. So now, as you can see, we have a correct error return, and this test passes. Now let's define the next case, which is, let's say, invalid name. And as you remember, for the name, the only thing is that the max sizes should not be greater than 50 characters. So I'm going to create a new struct here and define a valid ID and valid age, but then define an invalid name. So age, let's say we keep it 25, and then the name, I'm just going to introduce some random characters, and I don't think that's sufficient. Let's see how many more do we need. I'm just going to keep adding until I get, so let's say 51 characters. So what I can do right now is just to copy this error handling from here, and then we have to use the more specific error, which is the name too long. And let me just take a look, because I don't think these are enough characters. And let me compare. I have 59. Let me reduce that to just be above the limit, let's say somewhere here. So we are one character above the limit. So that should error actually. We are at 51 characters if you look at the bottom. And so above 50 characters, we should have an error. So running the test, as you can see, that is passed. And now, so that looks pretty good, and we can of course create test cases for age, etc. But as you can see, this involves a lot of copy pasting in every single case, because we have to replicate a lot of different things to add a new cases, and it's actually quite time consuming when you have a lot of fields in bigger APIs. So for table testing, let me define a new test function. So, and I'm going to call it test users, capital S, and it has the same structure as the test user case that we had before. So here we are going to define a for loop. The first argument is not necessary. The second one is the test case, which is the for loop variable. And this is going to loop over an array of anonymous structs, which has, and there are these three brackets, which I will explain pretty soon. And so we define an anonymous struct, like anonymous struct slice like this. And here within the first set of brackets, what we have to do is define the fields that we are going to use for the tests. So this is the definition phase. And then here we are going to define the actual test cases. And then within the third set of brackets, we are going to run the test. So running tests are quite easy because we have this t variable here. So we can just do something like t.run, and then within that we can run cases. We'll come back to that in a minute. Before that, let's start defining the actual fields. So the first field is a name field. This is not the username, but the name of the test case, and then the actual user, which has a separate name field. And then let's define an expected error, so we can define different errors for different cases instead of hard coding the errors. So now we can actually define the run function. So this takes two arguments. The first is the test case name, so it's test case.name, and the second argument is a function that is very similar to the standard test function. So VS Code prefills this for me when I just press F, but you can also do this manually. It takes the same argument as our test users function, and within this we are going to actually run the validation of our user. So now we can run the validate function of the user, which is within each test case. To do that, we can do something like test case.user.validate, and then the error that comes out of that, we have to handle it. Actually, we've done this before, so let's copy it from here. We just have to now match the errors to what we expect. And in this case, let's replace this with the error that's returned, and the error that we're expecting, the target error, has to be the value that comes from the expected error. So let's do test case.expected error. So we run this validation, you get an error out of it, and that error, you're comparing it to the error that is expected in the test case. And if that fails, then we just print that error and that case has failed. This becomes a bit clearer when we start defining a test case. So let's define the first case, which is a valid case. So we have to define these three fields. For name, let's call it valid, and the user is a valid user. So this is just going to be a user type or a user value, and then the expected error is nil because this is a valid user. So we can copy the valid user from up here. Let's just copy the fields. Okay, now let's run this back in our terminal. So I can just use the run that I used before. To run a specific case, let's use the run argument and specify test users, S as in plural. And this will run only the new function test users, and we have only one case there which is valid and it passes. So if you wanted to run, let's say, both, you can run test user. As you can see, users is within user, so it runs both of them. And if you want to run only the first test case, which is user, which is singular, then you have to comment out the second one. And then if you run, it runs the first case. This is a special case only because we're using the same name in both cases. They are quite similar names rather, user and users. But normally you don't have this problem. Now let's go into this and let's rerun users, which is the case we want to run. And of course, as you remember, this is valid. Now let's add a new test case. So we're going to add one invalid test case. And in order to do that, let's see which field we can use. So as you can see, the ID has three invalid cases. So it can be invalid character, it can be too short or too long. So let's create three separate invalid cases for the ID. And so the first one would be, let's say, user ID too short, which means it is less than 3 characters. Let's create 2. And now we have a specific error to match, which is invalid user ID. And let's put that here. And now let's run this case. And as you can see, it took me less than 5 seconds to create a new test case. I didn't have to copy paste 100 different things. Now let's also create one for too long. So the max characters is 16. And let's create something bigger than 16. So let's check that again. Yeah, so 16 is what we have set. So I'm just going to create alphabets. And I think if I J, K, up to P should be 17, no, Q. Q is 17 characters, so that's above the limit, and this should also error. And now if you run, once again, it took us a few seconds to create the new test case. Now just to wrap this up, the final thing would be invalid characters. And let me change this to some invalid characters that are defined here and go back to run it. As you can see, that also passes, and that test case is also very quickly set up. Now let's complete the loop and go to the name field. Name has only one case, which is max length, 50 characters. So copy paste this again, and let's change the name to username too long. And let me fix the ID because that will fail first otherwise. And I can just copy this 51 character string from this case up here, back down to, where's the case? There it is. And what I also have to do is adjust the expected error. So this is 51 characters, okay, that's good. And I also have to, the age is fine, and I have to adjust this error. So I'm going to copy the name of the error from here and use that there. And again, run the case, and we see that this also passes because this is invalid, and that's good. And the final two cases are that the age is too less or too large. And we can create two special cases for that. Copy and paste again, and we can call this user age to maybe low. That could be the case. And let's fix this name here, otherwise that would fail first. And let's make it 17, let's say. Run it. Oh, we got the wrong name here, so let's fix that. The error should be error age out of range. And once you do that, if you now run, you see that that test case also has passed. And we can see that within the test users test, you have these the last case that we've run. And let's also finally do that for the other case, which is too high. I think the number is 120, so let's put it to 121. Let's check here. Yeah, so we set it to 120, make it 121, run it, and that also passes. So as you can see, it's extremely easy for you to just keep adding cases like this within a few seconds instead of a lot of copy pasting. And you also get a very nice overview of all the cases that have passed and failed. Now, for example, in the future, if you add other fields, let's say address as a string and email, for example, of this user, then, and whatever fields in the future you want to define, all you have to do is go here, define some validations. Let's say for the address, some ranges, define some validation for the email as a valid email. And you can go to this test, just copy paste this value and just adjust it to having an invalid email or a valid email, invalid address, etc. And within a few seconds, you're adding test cases for all of your new fields that you're adding. So this is super easy to use and extremely useful, and we use it a lot in Golang testing.